So I have to explain my rather odd title first, and I admit that this was a little bit opportune because I was thinking immediately after Cancun, to what extent will good science have informed the deliberations and decisions of that wondrous group of policymakers gathered in that hellhole on the coast of Mexico to come up with something to avoid this phenomenon of runaway climate change? Well, the answer, of course, is that Cancun didn't achieve very much other than prevent a complete breakdown. And preventing a complete breakdown is seen as a complete triumph. So it sort of tells you really where we are at the moment regarding the complex issues, this complex interface between science, policy making, public opinion, and an approach to climate change that I will map out very briefly this evening. So I'm going to try and delve into why it is that good science on its own is insufficient, it would seem, to persuade our systems today, our political systems today, to make the changes that are required. Why is that? We like to think, since the time of the Enlightenment, that we are, largely speaking, a rational society acting on empirical data to put in place appropriate policies and changes. Well, I start with a slightly irreverent cartoon to encapsulate the model of what we call progress today. It is a very simple version of it, but basically that is it. And since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've continued to see the growth of the numbers of human beings on this planet. We've continued to see the growth in the scale of the economy. And as we get more people getting richer, the demand on the planet's life support systems and resources increases every year. And this is just absolutely hunky-dory as long as you don't look at the socket on the right-hand side of the screen. If you ignore the socket, it's a brilliant model for progress. And by and large, most politicians historically have ignored the degree to which the planet can go on underwriting our particular pattern of economic activity. And right now, well, for about the last 20, 30 years, they've suddenly realized it won't, which explains why most politicians look like that electrician in this cartoon, because they're scared out of their tiny wits as to what this really means. I'm going to start with a high point, obviously. I have been accused of being slightly, peculiarly obsessed with Jeremy Clarkson, and I can't help but admit that he does loom rather large in my sort of scoping of why the world is in such a mess today. Because I know perfectly well that there are more people in this world who would be prepared to listen to what Jeremy Clarkson has to say about climate change than to me. And that's really quite worrying. I have no modesty about this, no false modesty either for what it's worth. He just is able to persuade people that he is a fantastic expert on anything to do with climate change. And this gets me into my context this evening about denialism. Now, this is not a quote from Jeremy Clarkson, you understand, because he wouldn't utter such words like that. It is actually the title of a quite brilliant book by a man called Michael Spector, the science correspondent of the New York Times. And I'm going to give you a little, not quite a bibliography, but some titles at the end of my talk just to steer you towards one or two of these books. Fantastic book, which essentially explains why it is that the likes of Jeremy Clarkson are able to command such incredible levels of credulity and faith amongst populations like ours today. Why does he do that? Well, you think Jeremy Clarkson might be a problem? Have a look at this fella. This is a new person in my life. It is a Republican congressman from Michigan who came out with these historic words: God created the earth and he will take it out when he wants to. That's all you need to know about climate change. Now, there are tons of nutters in America, and quite a large number of them belong to the Republican Party. So there's nothing that surprising about someone like that saying something like that, especially as he belongs to an extremely zealous evangelical sect in Michigan. But why should you all be scared out of your wits? Because he has just been appointed. chairman of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. This is the Congress's most important committee dealing with energy and climate issues. This is the man that President Obama has to go and negotiate with in terms of climate policy in the United States. And you can see that the conversation would be just a touch limited if all you have to offer is the prospect of millenarian apocalypse. I'll come back to President Obama a bit later. But I want to start just by reminding you that we're not kind of messing around here. This is a rather interesting little look at the language of climate change, which is quite significant. When in 1992, at the Earth Summit, the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed up to by all the gathered countries, including the United States, of course, in those days. What politicians were exhorted to do was to avoid everything they possibly could to avoid dangerous climate change. That was the terminology in the Framework Convention, still is the terminology in the Framework Convention. By the time we got to Kyoto in 1997, scientists had started to bring to politicians' attention their concern about what is called non-linear climate change. So instead of the climate changing gradually and more or less predictably over time, scientists started to highlight the dangers revealed through the historical record of the climate changing very fast in non-linear ways, going from one state to another state in relatively short periods of time, i.e. not geological periods of time. By the time we got to the third report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we were talking about doing everything in our power to avoid runaway climate change. And by the time we got to the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel, the terminology had moved us on to doing everything in our power to avoid irreversible climate change. 1992 to 2007. And the science has progressively got more and more robust, more and more disturbing in terms of the potential for something so utterly catastrophic in the lives of humankind that it does put it in a completely different league from every other issue that we're dealing with today. Which is why I'm going to focus, as I look at the role of science, I am going to focus on climate change. There are many other scientific issues we could look at, but I think we'd get lost if we tried to cover the entire patch. So just to remind you, this is the IPCC consensus in the fourth assessment report. Quite an important reframing of what we know about the science now. The consensus is, confirmed in Copenhagen, by the way, a year ago by world leaders, that we ought to be doing everything we can to stay below an average temperature increase of more than 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. That's the headline. Any one of those world leaders, including China, India, America, Saudi Arabia, Russia, various other places around the world, has now signed up to a statement that says we must avoid the average temperature increase being more than 2 degrees centigrade. Now, we don't really know whether 2 degrees centigrade is quite as robust a threshold as we'd like it to be, because, as scientists will tell you, we've never cooked a planet before. We actually don't really know what happens at 1.9 degrees centigrade or 2.1 degrees centigrade. We haven't really got a clue. It's just now emerged as a consensus view that below 2 degrees centigrade, we've got a sort of 50-50 chance of avoiding all that irreversible stuff, runaway stuff. Above 2 degrees centigrade, the odds begin to lengthen, and it starts getting very dodgy indeed. So, good scientists say, fine, okay, that's a bit of a political judgment, because frankly we haven't got any empirical data from a previous experiment to work on. But it's our best bet, our best advice to the politicians, which they've accepted. Once you set that temperature threshold, then you can do all the rest of the science completely logically. Because we can calculate very precisely what levels of concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will keep us below and what levels will take us above. And once you've calculated the concentrations, you can go on to calculate the required emission cuts.